Hi, this is Theodore Holden in Southeast Texas, and what I would like to talk about tonight involves electricity and the nature of the electromagnetic forces which do the heavy lifting in the cosmos, the fact of electricity being the most common and cheapest commodity that there is in the universe at large, right? And the question of the gravity-only cosmology which our schools teach, which involves a claim that it's only gravity that does anything serious, that does things like creating solar systems out of swirling cosmic dust or holding spiral galaxies together. And the question of how much sense that makes, I think I found a good analogy for that. The analogy goes back to a television show that you saw in the 1950s, which was called Death Valley Days. And that television show was sponsored by a company that was called the Pacific Coast Borax Company, right? And they marketed borax products, particularly a hand soap, which was called Boraxo. And they called this product 20 Mule Team Boraxo. Why is that, right? The advertisement showed a team of 18 mules and 2 horses pulling one of these gigantic wagons loaded with 10 tons of borax 100 miles out of Death Valley to California, where it could be picked up by the railroads, right? So that the analogy that I would like you to try to picture would be having a mouse try to pull one of those wagons, right? That is the analogy for having gravity. Gravity is by 40 orders of magnitude the weakest force in nature, right? That's like, in other words, having gravity try to create a solar system out of cosmic dust or to hold a spiral galaxy together is essentially the same thing as wanting to have a mouse pull one of those borax wagons, that you normally would have, like the 20 mule teams trying to pull. Any rate, so that's essentially ridiculous, right? But that's what they teach in our schools. That's what your tax dollars pay for. So, you've got a question of what exactly powers the main things that you see in the cosmos, right? Now you have a picture which everybody should take a look at, to have a mental idea of what electricity looks like in the universe. This is called the local supercluster of galaxies, right, which is called Laniakea, and this shows essentially something which looks for all the worlds like a lightning strike. It looks like an electrical breakdown, like you would see. I mean, if you're looking at a bolt of lightning in the sky, this is exactly the same kind of thing that you're going to see, right? There's one little red dot in this picture which covers the Milky Way galaxy, and you see other kinds of pictures of the Milky Way galaxy where you see where you see a red dot that covers our sun, right? In other words, the red dot only covers one star in those pictures, right? In this picture, like I said, the red dot covers a whole galaxy, and it's like the picture shows like a cluster of galaxies, and there's other super clusters of galaxies, right? So you've got that, and then you've got the question of Birkeland currents and Herbig Haro strings, right? Space itself is a plasma, it's not a vacuum. A plasma is a very, very good electrical conductor, right? You get electrical currents flowing across colossal regions of space due to charge separation across those regions. And these currents are called Birkeland currents. They take 2 forms, right? The most common form, I suspect, is this double helix, right? It looks like a DNA RNA string, 2 currents which cross each other, wrapped around each other, cross each other, and the points at which these currents cross each other are called Z pinch or Z pinch points. You get electrical short circuiting at those points and electromagnetic pinch effect, which does have the power. These Z pinch points do have the power to agglomerate the power, the plasma of space into much more substantial objects, into stars and protostars, right? So that these are, and this is also the reason that stars most often appear in pairs or in groups, right? That would be, that they call those, well, what you're seeing is like a string of stars, right? It looks like a string of Christmas tree lights which have been pulled taut, or like a shish kebab with the shishes all lit up somehow or other. It's like that would be a Herbig Haro object named after the two astronomers who first observed these things, right? I call them Herbig Haro strings because obviously more than one object involved. Right now, articles that you'll find on the internet will claim that a Herbig Haro object amounts to a jet of a material in space. That doesn't work. Okay, it's like in the near vacuum of space, it's like a jet of material would dissipate almost instantaneously. And there's a couple of other things wrong with that idea as well. Right, the idea of a Herbig Haro object being a jet of material doesn't explain the round nodules that you see, right? In other words, it doesn't explain the stars that you see forming at these Z pinch points. On a very much larger scale, it's like plasma physics phenomena scale, right? They work the same way at different scales. On a very much larger scale, these Birkeland currents create strings of galaxies, right? And standard physics, standard astrophysics has no explanation for a string of galaxies. There's no way to believe that, right? Now the other thing, aside from strings of stars multi-star systems, aside from strings of galaxies, the other thing that you see Birkeland currents doing in the universe is powering spiral galaxies, right? In other words, you get which they'll call a jet also, right, running through the center of a spiral galaxy. What you've really got is one of these Birkeland currents running through the center of the galaxy and turning it, right, so that a spiral galaxy is basically a homopolar motor, right? It behaves exactly like the electric meter that you used to see on the side of houses. And again, this is the way that the heavy lifting gets done in the universe. Again, it has nothing to do with gravity. And like I said, trying to ask gravity to do any of these kinds of things, it's nonsensical. It's like wanting to have a mouse pull one of those giant wagons. You end up needing things which you shouldn't need, right? In other words, they understand that the gravity by itself cannot explain the formation of a spiral galaxy, what holds it together, right? So that they invent things like dark matter. Once you understand that it's electromagnetic forces which are governing spiral galaxies, then you don't need dark matter anymore. They claim that dark matter is 95% of the universe. I mean, if that were the case, we'd be having to vacuum this stuff up off of our carpets 3 or 4 times a day, right? That makes no sense whatsoever. You don't need, like I said, if somebody believes in electricity, you don't need dark matter or anything like that, right? That's just a kind of a problem associated with the gravity-only cosmology. I am going to want to talk about the formation of our own solar system as an original Birkeland current and associated Herbig Haro string. But before I do that, I'd like to clear up a couple of other misconceptions that you get from our school's and the doctrines that they teach, right? And you would no sooner start to study the controversy involving Immanuel Velikovsky in the 1950s, or some of the materials that you see like in plasma or electric cosmology websites like thunderbolts.info, right? And you very quickly get the idea that a number of the things that you've been taught in school are wrong, that you've got basic misconceptions which have found their way into science over the last 100 years. And the two that I would like to talk about involve like the age of the Earth, I guess that would be number two, right? And then number one is going to be the question of what exactly a star is. Is a star actually a nuclear furnace or a thermonuclear furnace, which is what we are taught in our schools, right? And this gets into the question of sunspots, and I think most people have heard the term sunspot, right? And they've never really seen an accurate picture of one of these things, having any kind of an idea of what it actually looks like. And basically, if a star actually was a thermonuclear furnace, then from the core of the star outwards, it would just keep getting cooler, right? I mean, you would get up to the surface of the star, and then out into the atmosphere of the star, and it would just keep getting cooler, right? It's like a sunspot. You can see from these pictures, right? It's like you've got electrical tufting, and then the electrical tufting surrounds a black area, right? And what you're actually getting is that the surface activity and the electrical activity on the surface breaks down, and you are seeing into the interior of the star, right? And if a star actually was a thermonuclear furnace, then a sunspot would be blue or white. It wouldn't be black, right? The fact that the sunspots that we see are black indicates that the interior of our sun is much cooler and much colder than the surface or the atmosphere above the surface, right? So that like what we're being taught is backwards. A star is not a thermonuclear furnace. A star is a light bulb. It's a plasma physics phenomenon which is powered by one of these same Birkeland currents, right? And Birkeland currents have three modes, as I understand it. You've got a dark mode, you've got a glow mode, and then you've got like an arc mode, which would be highly visible. That would be like an arc welder or a bolt of lightning. At any rate, what seems to be the case with our sun is that like the current which powers it is essentially in dark mode, and then as it contacts the star itself, it's being necked down into arc mode, right? But for the most part, it's not visible. Now, in past ages, this basic systemic Birkeland current that we had was highly visible. I want to get into that. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about, so in other words, the idea of a star being a thermonuclear furnace is a misconception. The other misconception involves the age of our Earth. And somewhere back around 2006, you had this Mary Schweitzer from the University of North Carolina State in Raleigh, who was working with a Tyrannosaur find out there in Montana. And they had a small helicopter to try to get pieces of this thing back to the university to study. They didn't have a Chinook or some sort of a big military helicopter, right? So they had to saw this femur bone in half. So they got a chainsaw and sawed this leg bone in half, right? And separately took the halves of this thing back to the university where they could study it. And once they got there, since they had this thing sawed in half, the idea had never occurred to anybody prior to that time, right? It's like, everybody always just assumed that, those kinds of remains were going to be like tens of millions of years old, and that there wouldn't, one of the things you obviously wouldn't find after 10 million years would be soft tissue, right? But somebody in the group said, hey, it's like we've actually got this thing, so, it would be easier it would be to take a Boy Scout knife or something and flake off pieces of this material, put on a slide, put that under a microscope. And what do you suppose they saw, right? Well, they saw soft tissue, including like blood and blood vessels and collagen and meat like you would find in a grocery store. And that poor woman got all kinds of grief over that, right? It's like since that time they've been finding increasing numbers of dinosaurs, increasing cases of dinosaur soft tissue involving several different kinds of dinosaurs, including, like I said, including all of that stuff, including skin cells of all things, and like they've actually sent some of that material off to the dating laboratories, like at a couple of the colleges, like at the University of Georgia, I believe, and of course, when you talk about radiocarbon dating, you're looking at an outer limit of 60,000 years, somewhere right around 60, 65,000 years. Nothing is going to radiocarbon date, right? But that stuff did radiocarbon date. And the numbers they were getting, I think that the oldest figure they had for would be about 40,000 years, right? And that says, that when you talk about the age of the Earth, all you can do is try to come up with an educated guess, right? I mean, that's too much water has gone over the dam, too many things have happened to come up with anything realistic, right? Or to come up with anything definitive. They talk about heavy metal isotope dating schemes, right? But they don't explain why the heavy metals would even be near the surface of the Earth. Right, I mean, given your standard theories, you would think that the heavy metals would all be down near the core. Okay, so the heavy metals that we find on the Earth, near the surface, right, are either going to have arrived via impact events or plasma physics phenomena, so that any kind of ages that we get from these heavy metals is going to be the age of the heavy metal. It's not really going to tell you anything about the age of the Earth. At any rate, what you can do to try to come up with an educated guess as to the Earth's age, in my version of it at least, would be to take that 40,000 year figure and assume that that's somewhere possibly ballpark for begin date for dinosaurs, right? Plug that into your standard little 24-hour clock model and extrapolate, right? And you get if you do that, you get like an age of around 700,000 years, somewhere around there for the Earth. And if you multiply that by 5 or 10 or whatever to try to give the evolutionites every possible shot at it, well, then you're still only talking about a few million years, right? Now, obviously, Bishop Ussher would not be happy with that sort of an idea of the age of the Earth, but then neither would the evolutionites, right? So that's basically my take on that sort of subject. Okay, and what I would like to talk about now would be the entire question of the Earth forming up as a Birkeland current on a Herbig Haro string. And so we need to start with the idea of our solar system originating as a Birkeland current and its associated Herbig Haro string, right? That is to say, like something which looks like a string of Christmas tree lights which has been pulled taut. And we need to get an idea of what that looked like, and also an idea of how the system could have gone from that to what we have now, which is an orbiting system, right? And it could easily be that orbiting systems are rare in our galaxy. I mean, I don't know that we have any information on that, right? Nonetheless, it could easily be that most solar systems retain this linear alignment, okay? In this linear alignment, nothing was orbiting anything else, right? I mean, yet everything was just stretched out in one line. Birkeland currents turn, they rotate, right? I mean, this is why you see spiral galaxies rotating and being turned by the Birkeland currents, so that if some part of a Herbig Haro string were to break off from the main part, right, well then you have the beginning of orbits with something like that, right? In other words, the part that broke off would be orbiting the center line of the system, what had been the center line of the system. And I believe that that's what we had happen with our own systems. We need to get into that, right? It's like what you see And this image shows the sun off to one side of the whole thing, I mean on your right, and then Jupiter, and then Jupiter's moons, right, and then a bunch of empty space, right? The sun and Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, right, these things have axis tilts less than 10 degrees, right? That would be a primordial system. You've got a couple of oddball cases, Uranus, Pluto, I think. One or two other things which have oddball axis tilts. Axis tilts are the most major key that there is to understanding prehistory, right? You've got two major keys, that's like axis tilts and then eye sizes, right? The relative sizes of the eyes of the creatures living on one of these bodies. And it turns out that the cosmology and human history, the history of living things have to be studied together. There's no way to make sense out of the one or the other separately. Okay, so we'll get to that, right? But it's like you've got the bodies of this former Saturnian system, which are the bodies, Saturn, Neptune, Mars, and Earth, which are the bodies with this roughly 26-degree axis tilt, right? That's a signature, right? These bodies have to have originated as a separate group, right, and to have been captured by the Sun-Jupiter system at some fairly recent point in time, right. At any rate, so you've got that, and you've got the question of how this whole thing happened, right? You've got to get past one other little thing that doesn't make sense the way it's taught, right? I mean, aside from everything else that they teach us in our schools, they teach us that this planet Earth is our original home world, right? Leftists will tell that Earth is our mother, right? It turns out that Earth has never been a reasonable home world for humans, okay? Lloyd Pye said that hominids, like the Neanderthal, were native to Earth, but the humans were not, right? And that was demonstrable. He didn't even know anything about Ganymede, or the possibility that might have been something else that qualified as a human homeworld in that system 100,000 years ago, right? But without even knowing anything about that, he had made the determination that the difference between the gulf between humans and hominids was so great that the same planet could not plausibly serve as a home world for both kinds of creatures. Okay, we need to get to that. Have to ask yourself, what would a reasonable human home world look like? It would have to have at least four things, right? It would have to be warm, the lack of fur. It would have to be bright, the relatively tiny eyes and the lack of decent night vision. Okay, it would have to be wet, which would correspond to the aquatic adaptations that Elaine Morgan wrote about. And she was not talking about humans being the tall creatures, like walking around in ankle-deep or knee-deep waters trying to spear fish, right? She was talking about humans being creatures who spent major portions of their lives in water that would be substantially over their heads, right? So in other words, quasi-aquatic creatures. There are two ways you could look at this theory of Elaine Morgan's, right? You could view it as another version of evolutionism, in which case it's just another flavor of BS. Or you could look at it as a theory of human adaptation, in which case it would be the best theory that's ever been put forward. Nonetheless, it's never gotten any traction in academia. And there are two reasons for that, right? It's like, number one, there's no physical evidence of it. There's no fossil evidence of any sort of an aquatic ape or anything like that ever having lived on the Earth. Number one. Number two, there's never been a body of water on Earth which would be safe for humans to live in. Okay, you only need to spend 10 or 15 minutes in the ancient sea monsters section of any major museum, right, to understand why humans have never lived in water on Earth, right? It's a perfectly good theory. It just needs a different kind of world to happen on. That's basically what you're looking at with Elaine Morgan. So it's like that's the last thing that a human home world would have to have. It would have to be safe. Safe from every kind. It was safe from monsters, both sea monsters and land monsters. You couldn't have sharks or jellyfish or anything like that in the waters trying to snap up humans. Humans are relatively defenseless against crocodiles or or sharks or anything like that in water, right? And you couldn't have, like, you couldn't have hyenodons or entelodons or anything like that, or tyrannosaurs or other kinds of carnosaurs waiting to snap humans up no sooner did they ever step out of the water. Okay, so you couldn't have anything like that on a reasonable human home world. Now, the other thing that you would need would be safety from cosmic radiation, especially if you're going to be close to a dwarf star, like Jupiter and Saturn used to be, right? It's like dwarf stars are major sources of cosmic radiation. Now, the most major thing that protects us from cosmic radiation on Earth is the intrinsic magnetosphere, right? I mean, it's a magnetosphere which is not borrowed from some larger body. In our system now, there are only two things which have, there are only two rocky bodies that have an intrinsic magnetosphere. That would be like Earth and Ganymede. Ganymede is that largest moon of Jupiter's, right? It's like just a little bit smaller than Mars. And, right now, Ganymede is a sort of frozen wasteland. I mean, you couldn't picture humans living on Ganymede under present conditions. Nonetheless, like I say, the most major clue to this whole thing is axis tilts. The fact of Jupiter having this very low, like about a 3-degree axis tilt, means that it was part of the Sun system. It was up very close to the Sun at some earlier age, right? And that corresponds to what we know about gas giant planets within the Milky Way, right? It's like we know that at this point that the most normal situations you have for gas giant planets or dwarf stars, which are aligned with a main sequence star, like our Sun, is for the dwarf star or the gas giant planet to be up close to the main sequence star, and they call those things hot Jupiters, right? You'll find that term in recent literature. Nonetheless, if you put Jupiter up close to the Sun, then, and if you put the Galilean moons of Jupiter on the far side away from the Sun, what you're going to see is that, like, Ganymede would be a freshwater ocean world, right? One of the things they try to explain about Ganymede would be the ultra-low moment of inertia, the fact that most of the mass of Ganymede is concentrated towards the center, right? And they normally try to explain that as it having a very, very deep outer mantle of salt water. Nonetheless, there's no evidence of sodium around Ganymede, right? It's like what Troy McLaughlin has proposed. It makes perfect sense, is that this outer mantle is not salt water, it's pumice, which is lighter than water. Pumice floats, right? This would have been created at some very early stage of the existence of Ganymede, just from arcing between Ganymede and Jupiter. And you would have had, like I say, pumice floats. You would have had, like at some recent point, you would have had both islands and floating bergs of pumice and luxuriant vegetation, right? So you would have a freshwater ocean world, bright, wet, safe. You would have had all of the ingredients that you would want for a human home world, right? Now, the Earth, like I say, you go back a couple of 100,000 years, beautiful world for Neanderthals and other hominids, not a reasonable place for humans at all. Okay, so I mean, that's part of the whole thing. So you've got to picture this whole thing looking like, the Sun and Jupiter's moons, possibly Mercury, sitting there to the right of this picture, and then off to the then a bunch of empty space, and then off to the left, the Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth, the bodies with the, I say roughly 26-degree axis tilts, 23 to 28 degrees, right? But that's a separate system. It hasn't been captured, right? It's like the capture of this of the Saturnian part of the system corresponded to the flood that you read about in the Bible, right? I mean, that probably was the proximate cause of the flood. Why do they talk about sin being involved with the flood, right? It's like The story has been transcribed any number of times by Levites and priests whose basic business model is guilt-tripping people over sin, right? I don't think the flood had anything to do with sin. Nonetheless, the flood's a true story. At any rate, so you've got to explain how you go from having a situation where you've got the sun and Jupiter's moons and then humans living on Ganymede on the outside of that part of the system, and then a bunch of empty space, and then Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth on the outside of that system. Hominids like the Neanderthal living on Earth, right? How do you get from that to what we have now? It's like Trey McLaughlin believed that the sun had captured the Jovian system, right, and had slowed down. The whole thing was moving to the right in this picture that I'm showing. And that the Sun-Jupiter system was slowed by this capture of the Jupiter part of the system, and that allowed the Saturnian part of the system to catch up to the Sun-Jupiter system. So at one point, you had a transfer, you had a near collision, right? It's like you would not have had an outright, the two things on the outside of the respective systems would be the Earth, which is the outside of the Saturnian part of the system, and then Ganymede, which was the outside of the Sun-Jupiter part of the system, would have come very close to colliding, right? They were prevented from colliding by electromagnetic forces. Nonetheless, you had an electrical water bridge between Ganymede and Earth. You had this transfer of humans and other aquatic mammals from Ganymede to Earth, and then you had, the Saturnian system in its entirety bounced away, right? Like I said, it was not able to collide into the Sun-Jupiter system, but it bent outwards, right? In other words, it's the same kind of thing that you get with train wrecks, like when this Colonel Crush used to charge people to watch the train collisions, right? They get two steam locomotives which had outlived their usefulness, and just have them crash together at 50 miles an hour and charge people to watch, right? At any rate, the cars that could no longer go forward would go, the only way they could go is outwards, right? So that you've got this Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth system being bent outwards and bouncing back away from the Sun-Jupiter system. And then you had like another long space of time during which you had like the Saturnian system back to existing as a separate system, but off at an angle, no longer part of the straight line. In other words, at this point you have this Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth part of the system being separated from the center line of the system and being off at a 26-degree angle, right? Now, the way that you get this 26-degree axis tilt for these bodies is that these bodies flew into the plane of the Sun-Jupiter system at a 26-degree angle, and then as the individual bodies were captured and began to orbit the sun as they do now, then ordinary gyroscopic force caused them to retain this 26-degree angle of approach in the form of axis tilts, right? So that's what the evidence says, right? So that you've got you've got this group of bodies which would be orbiting the center line of the system, right? The old center line of the system, and like I said, this old center line had amounted to a Birkeland current, which, to the extent that it exists now, does not show. It's not visible, right? And it would have been highly visible in the period of time before before the Saturnian group was captured outright. It had been orbiting this, it had been circling, because these Birkeland currents turn, had been orbiting the center line, right, and this Birkeland current, and at that point you get to the Pythagoreans. You know, Pythagoras is the man who invented the theorem about right triangles. You know, sum of the square of the hypotenuse equal the sum of the squares of the short sides, right? He was also involved with a general theory of philosophy, and people that followed him were called Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans talk about a central fire, right, and about the bodies of the cosmos orbiting the central fire, so that what they were talking about really was like probably a memory at the point at which this stuff was written down, because you're only talking about a few hundred years before Christ for Pythagoras, right? So I mean, this thing would not have still been visible at that time. Nonetheless, you know, they had it on the authority of all traditions that at one point, you know, the sun, the moon, the earth, the other bodies that you see in the cosmos had been orbiting this Birkeland current, which was highly visible at that point, and which they referred to as the central fire. At any rate, what you had was the second approach of the Saturnian system to the Sun-Jupiter system was on a spiral path, right? It was no longer on a straight line. So the original approach of the Sun, of the Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth system to the Sun-Jupiter system had been on a straight line. That's the only way you could have had any sort of a transfer of creatures or an electrical water bridge between Ganymede and the Earth, right? It's like, you know, that can't happen if everything is, you know, if this approach is on a spiral or anything like that, that's not going to allow anything like that to take place. Nonetheless, on the second approach, you have these bodies approaching on a spiral which took the shape of a cone, right? And the things which would have gotten to the Sun-Jupiter system first were going to be the small body, the rocky bodies, Mars and Earth. And then later, you know, a few hundred years, whatever, a couple of thousand years later, Neptune and Saturn, right? So what actually happened was that the the Mars-Earth pair had been caught up with the Jupiter-Venus pair, and that the Earth had gone, in a very short space of time, the Earth had gone from a Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth alignment to a Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Earth alignment, right, which is the place where the people with the Thunderbolts.info group got confused, right? It turns out that, remember I said that, like, axis tilts are the main key to this whole thing, that Venus has exactly the same axis tilt as Jupiter to within less than half a degree, right? And nobody should believe in super coincidences, right? What that really says is that the people arguing about the case of Immanuel Velikovsky in the 1970s and 80s should have been talking about axis tilts and not about thermal balance or anything like that, right? How hot is too hot to be a sister planet to the Earth? You know, the real key to the whole thing is not the question of thermal balance. The real key to the whole thing is axis tilts, right? The fact that Venus has the exact same axis tilt as Jupiter, right? And when the Earth and Mars approached the Sun-Jupiter system, the first thing that was, they flew around the Galilean moons, right? So they didn't get caught up with Ganymede again. What happened, the thing that was sitting right out there for them to get caught up with was this Jupiter-Venus pair, right? So you ended up for a short period of time with an alignment which looked like Jupiter, and then Venus, and then Mars, then Earth, right? And there's another question about Venus, right? Like, where does this backwards rotation come from? Okay, that comes from Venus having been ejected from the equatorial region of Jupiter, right? In other words, you have to, if you look at this thing from the top, right, like from the North Pole of Jupiter or something like that, and if the whole thing from that view appears to be spinning counterclockwise, then what you'll see is that as this core material is being ejected right now, this is the claim that Velikovsky made. Velikovsky, I'm sorry if I sound a little bit disjointed talking about this stuff, right, but it's a lot of things to try to keep track of. Velikovsky claimed that the ancients were describing real events, but in their own language and their own vernacular, not ours, right? Now, the ancient authors were not going to write down that Venus amounted to core material being ejected from Jupiter as a means of relieving electrical stress, right? That would not have been part of their way of looking at things, right? They wrote that Athena had been born from the head of Zeus, right, or something equivalent to that, okay? So that if you're looking at Venus being ejected from the equatorial region of Jupiter, and if you're looking at this whole thing spinning counterclockwise, then there's going to be, as this core material is being ejected, there's going to be a higher degree of contact on the right-hand side than on the left, right? In other words, you know, the material, the material which is moving into this core material that's being injected is going to cause it to turn the wrong way. You have to think about gears, right? In other words, you get two gears meshing. One turns one way, the other turns the other way, right? That's the way transmission works in your car. And that's what you have to think. That's the reason that you have this retrograde spin of Venus. At any rate, so you had a short period of time when, you know, the Earth, you had Jupiter, and then Venus, and then Mars, then Earth, right? And this was after the flood. This was for a period of time, and you had a period of time when you had this alignment with Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and Earth, and then like I said, the rocky bodies, Mars and Earth had arrived first, right, and then Saturn and Neptune arrived, and they managed to pull Jupiter out into the regions where Jupiter and Neptune and Saturn are now, right, and that left these smaller bodies in close to the sun, right? They just left the Earth and Venus and Mars abandoned there, right? And that left Earth and Mars and Venus on orbits which were unstable and dangerous for a period of centuries after the flood, right? So that you had this catastrophe involving Venus, which, in fact, catastrophes involving both Venus and Mars at different points in time. I mean, like after the flood, and you read about that in Isaiah 14, right? I mean, basically, Isaiah 14 is a hymn of thanksgiving after Venus had settled into a stable orbit. You can read about that, right? Worlds in Collision. It's this book that they tried to ban in 1950. At any rate, that may have to do it for the time being, right? That's the way that you get from a linear system, which is created by a cosmic Birkeland current and its associated Herbig-Haro string, to the kind of a rotating orbital system that we have now. Right, like I said, that may be a sort of an oddity in the galaxy at large. I don't know for sure. It's like it could easily be that most solar systems still retain these linear alignments, which they would have had, when they were young. Right, I don't know what happens as solar systems age. Right, but that's basically how we got to where we are. If you have followed me this far, then you have some idea of what I'm talking about regarding a Ganymede hypothesis, a radically different vision of a history of our solar system, and a universe which is governed pretty much entirely by electrical and electromagnetic forces and not by gravity. Okay, I'd like to sort of review what I've gone over so far, summarize, and to possibly hit a few things which I may have missed. the most major thing which operates in the cosmos is what you call the cosmic Birkeland current, which is this thing which has a couple of different forms, right? But the most common form is that of a twisted pair of currents, which resembles a DNA spiral, and where the pairs of currents cross each other, you have electrical short circuiting and an electromagnetic pinch effect. They call that a Z-pinch, right? And that pinch effect does have the power to agglomerate the plasma of space into substantial objects, right? Stars, spiral galaxies, strings of galaxies, right? Depending on scale, all these kinds of plasma physics phenomena scale. They behave the same way at different scales, right? It's like at the smallest scale that we're concerned with, the Birkeland currents and the Herbig Haro strings that they create. In other words, a string of two or more stars or galaxies, which show up at these electromagnetic pinch points. It's called a Herbig Haro string. And at the smallest scale, you've got strings of stars, which could include main sequence stars like our own sun, as well as dwarf stars like Jupiter and Saturn used to be at one time, right? You may have wondered why, the two chieftain gods of all of the ancient religions were the two were Jupiter and Saturn. They weren't the sun and the moon. I mean, if a bunch of primitive people today were to try to devise an astral religion off of the tops of their heads, they would end up worshiping the sun and the moon and possibly Venus, right? But it's like the two chieftain gods of every one of those old religions were Jupiter and Saturn, the two dwarf stars. You've got pictures of Birkeland currents and what they amount to. You've got a Birkeland current which runs through the center of our own galaxy and turns it, right? Birkeland currents turn spiral galaxies. It's like, a spiral galaxy is basically a homopolar motor. It behaves like the electric meter that you used to see on the sides of houses. And, like I say, the Birkeland current that runs through the center of our own galaxy is called a twisted pair nebula. Okay, you can find pictures of that online easily enough. Okay, you can find pictures of other spiral galaxies being turned by Birkeland currents. And what you have to do to find that online is to get on Google or whatever, right, and do an image search on two words, galaxy and jet, right? And that's because the vast majority of the people who study these kinds of things for a living regard what they're seeing as like a spiral galaxy and then a jet of materials, right? But that doesn't make any sense. It's like, in other words, a jet of dust or other material like that would dissipate almost instantly in the near vacuum of space. And you also see very clearly in some of these cases the nodules, the round bodies of these electromagnetic pinch points of the Birkeland current, which is running through the center of the galaxy, right? It's a common thing, but you have to look for galaxy and jet, right? And like I said, that's just because of a misunderstanding on the part of people who claim expertise in these areas. That's interesting enough. You've got the question of our own solar system and how it formed up exactly. This picture that I've shown so far is correct as far as the relative locations, the relative positions of the bodies in question, right? It's not correct as far as distance is involved. It's not to scale, right? It just gives you an idea of what this thing looks like. You have the sun on one side of this thing, and then Jupiter, and then Jupiter's moons, and I did not really have an idea as to where to put Mercury in that picture, right? Mercury could have been the far side of the sun, or it could have been a moon of Jupiter's at one point. There's no way to tell. Right, then you've got a bunch of empty space sitting there, which could amount to the distance between the sun and Pluto now, or it could be more like the distance between the Alpha Centauri pair and Proxima Centauri, right, which even experts claim is too great to be, for Proxima Centauri to be bound to the Alpha Centauri pair by gravity, right? That's almost certainly part of some sort of an ancient Herbig Haro string. As I mentioned, in the case of our own solar system, the major clues to understanding prehistory are axis tilts and eye sizes. Here's what the axis tilts tell us. It's like you've got Pluto and Uranus, which have axis tilts which are just out there. I mean, they don't seem to be related to anything much which is worth worrying about. The rest of the bodies in our system, which are major enough to be orbiting in their own right, which aren't moons of anything. Okay, it's like you've got two groups. You've got the one group which includes like the Sun and Jupiter and Mercury and Venus, which have axis tilts less than 10 degrees, right? That's one group, right? That's a primordial group. The fact of Jupiter having a near zero axis tilt means that Jupiter was up close to the Sun at some early period, and in fact, close to being a primordial situation. And that's the normal situation that you have in our galaxy, right, is for gas giants and dwarf stars, which are aligned with some main sequence star like our Sun, to be up close to the main sequence star. They call these things hot Jupiters. You can do a search on that. That turns up, right? The fact that you've got Venus and Jupiter having almost exactly the same axis tilt to within less than half a degree means that Immanuel Velikovsky was absolutely correct in claiming that Venus amounted to material which had been ejected from Jupiter fairly recently, as a means of relieving electrical stress. And you're talking about a body with a reasonable age estimate of 5, 10, 12,000 years, right? Probably more like 5 or 6,000. So that we know that this is the answer to Bishop Ussher, right, to any kind of a religiously oriented claim, that you could just add up the genealogies of the Bible and come up with an age of the earth for, of around 6,000 or 7,000 years. And that's the problem, right? In other words, we know what a 6,000-year-old planet looks like. I mean, Venus is, surface temperature is 850 degrees. Atmosphere, 90 bar CO2 atmosphere. It's like, if you weren't incinerated the instant you got down there, it's like to the surface of Venus, it's like a 3-mile-an-hour wind would knock you over. It's that thick, right? Massive thermal imbalance. The thing radiates a great deal more energy than it takes in from the sun. Massive upwards infrared flux. That is what a 6,000-year-old planet looks like. I mean, the Earth and Mars don't look like that at all. So they have to be substantially older than that, but not hundreds of millions or billions of years old. Right? There are problems with that. The dating schemes that they use are logically flawed. At any rate, so you've got that, and that's this primordial system, the Sun-Jupiter system, and then you've got a whole bunch of empty space. And then you've got the Saturnian group, which includes Saturn and Neptune, Mars and Earth. which all have axis tilts, which I would call, in an image, they look, visually they appear to be the same, right? It's like, I call it, roughly 26 degrees, right? These are, the axis tilts of this group range from about 23 to about 28 degrees. And this has to be viewed as a separate group. Okay, what actually happened, the reason they have those kinds of axis tilts is that basically, they were still lined up, in a linear alignment, like from that original Herbig Haro string, right? And they flew into the plane of the Sun-Jupiter system at a 26-degree angle, more or less, and as the individual bodies were captured first by the systemic Birkeland current and then by the sun itself, right? It was like they kept, just ordinary gyroscopic force caused them to keep that 26-degree angle of approach in the form of axis tilts, right? That's the reason that you have those kinds of axis tilts on those bodies. What the history of the system looks like is that you've got like a bright, warm system, Sun, Jupiter, Jupiter's moons, particularly Ganymede, and then off in the distance, you've got like a much darker and cooler, colder system, right? The kinds of creatures that you get in the one system and the other are different, right? It's like humans, require a different kind of home world than the Earth would have been, like 50 or 100,000 years ago. It's like humans have no fur of any sort, right? So, I mean, the human home world has to be warm, right? Humans have almost no night vision. A human home world has to be bright. Humans have no way to defend themselves against sharks or alligators or anything like that in water. I mean, they've got all these aquatic adaptations. There's no way to believe that humans ever lived in water on Earth, right? In other words, it just wouldn't work. Then humans also require safety from cosmic radiation, right? The only two bodies in our system that actually have this intrinsic magnetosphere that protects us from cosmic radiation are the Earth and Ganymede. Okay, Ganymede is this largest moon of Jupiter's, and the implication is that at some point, some tens of thousands of years ago, long time, right, you had humans and other aquatic creatures, mammals, right, being transferred from Ganymede to Earth. In other words, the Saturnian system originally had been dark, and the bodies inside that alignment, particularly Mars and Earth, were inside the plasma heliosphere of Saturn. So that you didn't see the outside, right? You didn't see space outside of this plasma heliosphere. You were living in a very dark, purplish or ultraviolet light environment, right? So that you've got these huge eyes. The other big clue to prehistory is eye sizes, the relative sizes of the eyes of the creatures of the one system and the other, right? It's like leftover creatures, lemurs, tarsiers, bush babies, owls, as well as essentially all dinosaurs, all hominids have these same kinds of huge eyes, right? I mean, you look at these Neanderthal reconstructions of Danny Venderminius, and you've got a fabulously bug-eyed kind of a creature, right? You've got like a very advanced bipedal ape with huge dark world eyes, and then like an Ice Age type fur coat, right? I mean, it's just completely unlike humans. If you really had to pick something for humans to be descended from that wasn't human, then, I mean, number one, the furthest thing from that you could get would be a hominid like the Neanderthal. It's like, it would have to be some other kind of an aquatic mammal. It'd have to be a seal or an otter, right? So you have to ask yourself, like if your grandfather or your great-grandfather, anybody like that, was a seal or an otter, right? I mean, that's that's the whole case against human evolution. At any rate, so that you've got this this approach. It's a lot like the sun and Jupiter slowing as the sun captured Jupiter, right, and then the Saturnian system eventually, over a period of thousands or tens of thousands of years, catching up to that. And then you get this very near approach, right? You get either an electrical water bridge or what they call a water tornado, or some other kind of a plasma physics phenomenon involving water, and you get this transfer of humans to Ganymede. At the same time, you get like a shock, and you get, I mean, you don't get like an outright crash of the one system into the other, right? It's like the Saturnian system bounced back. Not only did they bounce back away from the Sun-Jupiter system, but they bounced off of the center line, right? So that prior to this point, you had everything in our system was on the same central line of this Birkeland current, right? So that you didn't have anything orbiting anything else, right? So that had been the primordial version of this whole thing. You've got Trey McLaughlin's picture of what this Saturnian system would have looked like, you know, when you've got this plasma heliosphere and you've got the bodies inside this plasma heliosphere, right, which would have been Neptune and Mars and Earth, aside from anything else, right? But mainly Neptune and Mars and Earth, right? And the pictures that you get, you know, the ancient artwork that shows these things does not show an orbiting system. It shows something more like a, excuse me, more like an archery target, you know, with concentric circles, which is, you know, what somebody standing on Earth would have seen if you looked up into the sky, the top of the sky, right? I mean, you would have seen like Mars and then Neptune and then Saturn. At any rate, you know, that's what you had originally, right? It's like after the Saturnian system bounced backwards and off of the center line, then because, you know, it was still turning with the cosmic Birkeland current, you know, which was the center line of the system, right? And it would have been orbiting this center line in this Birkeland current, right? Now, how did ancients describe that? Well, the Pythagoreans described that as the bodies of our cosmos orbiting what they called a central fire, right? The central fire was this Birkeland current. And, you know, you can imagine what that would have looked like. This was as the Saturnian system was recoiling away and then eventually beginning the second approach to the Sun-Jupiter system where it was going to be captured, right? At this point, you had the Egyptians also describing this Birkeland current as the two ways they might have described it. One was a little bit more fanciful, right? But the major thing that they described it as was what they call the Jed column, and that's going to be like DJED, at least according to Egyptologists, right? And you can find pictures of that all throughout Egyptian hieroglyphics and the stories that you'll read on the sides of the pyramid walls, right? At any rate, that's what you've got for that period of time. And then you've got the Saturnian system arriving piecemeal to the Sun-Jupiter system where it was going to be, it wasn't going to bounce off this time, it was going to be captured, right? And it's like the first two things to arrive were going to be the Earth and Mars, right? And they were turning, you know, in a spiral, right? The approach was along a spiral so that they didn't get hung up with the Galilean moons or with Ganymede again a second time. The thing that was sitting out there at this point was Venus, Right, you had Jupiter, and then you had Venus, which had been ejected from the equatorial region of Jupiter, and you have the Earth going in a very short space of time, relatively, from a Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Earth alignment to a Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Earth alignment, which is the basis for a lot of mythology, right? This is the alignment which David Talbot and F. Cochran and the people at the Thunderbolts group were looking at. And it's easy to get confused, right? In other words, there's absolutely no way to believe that Venus was ever part of that Saturnian alignment, right? I mean, there's no way in the world it could have been. It would have that same 26-degree axis tilt if it did. It's like Venus has all the characteristics of having been ejected from Jupiter, exactly the way Immanuel Velikovsky described it. Okay, so the first two things to arrive were Earth and Mars, right, which ended up forming up this Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Earth alignment, which shows in mythological contexts, right, and then after some other period of time, which I couldn't even guess at, might have been a few dozen years, might have been a few centuries, even a couple of thousand years at any rate, the next things that arrived are going to be like Neptune and Saturn, right? And they pulled Jupiter out into these things, got tangled up with Jupiter, and pulled Jupiter out into the regions where you find Jupiter and these other gas giant planets now, and they left Mars and Earth and Venus and Mercury. They left the smaller planets sitting there naked and alone by themselves up close to the sun, where they are now. Right, so that's the basic history of our solar system. Like I said, the book that describes all of this is called The Ganymede Hypothesis. There's a free version in PDF format available on my little hobby shop website, which is called bearfabrique.com, like a bear in the woods, and then F-A-B-R-I-K. That's the normal European word for factory, like you're going to fabricate something. And there's also on Bear Fabrique, there's a link. Like I said, there's a PDF formatted version of this book which you can simply download and read at your own leisure. Right then, there's a link to an Amazon site with like a good quality color paperback, which is about $25 on Amazon for people that have to have paperbacks to feel good about reading books. At any rate, that as I understand it, is the basic prehistory of our system. Next time, take care.